So it gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody to this episode in the VOX-Pol lecture series for 2023. I'm Dr. Julian Drugan. Now, this week we have Jade Hutchinson, who's here to speak about ecosystems research. Jade will be talking about far-right online ecosystems and considering how a ecosystem of platforms and a network of different social media entities has shaped far-right extremism globally. Jade is a PhD student at the moment, currently completing his PhD between Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and also the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. So Jade, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julian. And thank you to the wider VOX-Pol network for hosting this occasion to speak with you all. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So today I'll be presenting findings from my doctoral research, as well as collaborations with colleagues at Macquarie and Groningen University, among others. This research largely sought to critically assess and improve the use of ecology when understanding as well as preventing far-right online extremism and violence. Today, I'll outline a descriptive definition of ecology, ecosystems, and the ecological approach. I will also identify and describe several ecological concepts or characteristics that emerged from biology and other disciplines who had also previously adopted ecology into the fold. I will explore different advantages and limitations of some of these concepts while highlighting their theoretical and methodological potential. I'll then illustrate these insights in reference to some of the collaborations that I mentioned earlier. And lastly, I'll try to draw on ecological thinking to provide at least one practical suggestion to you or any practitioner who may be managing at-risk individuals who were referred to concerns about their online activity. It was initially through Freudian psychology that ecologists found their opportunity to include humans in their study. So by the late 1800s, a man named Arthur George Tainsley failed to establish ecology as a respectable or accepted discipline at Oxford University. Despite his best efforts, though, to establish ecology at his own campus, Tainsley observed that ecological approaches were taking shape in many areas outside of Oxford, as well as outside of plant studies, writing in 1904 that ecology may now be considered almost a fashionable study. However, being Sigmund Freud's mentee, Tainsley then later synthesized his supervisor's research on psychology and then turned the concept of ecosystems inward. In a book he wrote over a decade later, and whom Freud unsurprisingly wrote a charitable review for, Tainsley had applied ecosystems to arguably the most controversial aspects in social life in order to aggressively promote ecosystems thinking among the intelligentsia, as well as in public consciousness, thinking of the human mind as this complicated, entangled circuit of stimulus response mechanisms that were said to be discharging flows of psychic energy. And Tainsley relied on industrial and steam-based analogies to further explain Freudian psychology and behavior. This is otherwise known as the hydraulic theory of emotion. Interestingly, Tainsley admitted at the time that these analogies were an illogical and contradictory procedure that only served to reduce the bewildering complexity of mental phenomena to something like order. In a publication later that same year, Tainsley further imposed ecosystems thinking onto human nature, suggesting that humans are like all other living organisms, and they should be or may be regarded as machines transforming energy from one form to another. Viewed like a machine, and when applied to natural environments, Tainsley eventually successfully advocated for ecological approaches to human psychology, as well as the organization of colonies that were said to reveal economic properties that could be better mapped and managed by the British Empire. Nearly 120 years later, ecology continues to be a fashionable study. Ecological concepts continue to accrue popularity, but instead of being turned inward as Tainsley once did, ecosystems are becoming progressively digitized to better map and manage security threats like those emerging from far-right digital ecosystems. I actually recently searched the number of references to both far-right and digital ecosystems made in scholarly publications, and I found these terms had risen dramatically in recent decades. Although their convergence may be merely a consequence of their mutual importance in intellectual life today, the use of ecosystems to understand how a network of platforms and devices shape far-right extremism and violence does not need to remain an illogical and contradictory procedure. However, there are important considerations to be made when drawing on these concepts so as to avoid portraying reality. As an evolutionary biologist once said to me, every metaphor must endure eternal vigilance. Like others before it, extremism and terrorism studies are beginning to turn toward ecology to better understand this dynamic and fleeting, yet interrelated and self-reinforcing nature that is online subcultures among the far right. And this aim is increasingly being accompanied by certain management strategies based on its insight. When translated into recent extremism and terrorism studies, the ecosystem metaphor was quickly and perhaps predictably rendered into in-group and out-group terminology, and scholars comment on these newly labeled ecosystems, how they constitute networked communities where extremist ideology grows and flows. Such ecosystems, it was supposed, may be crucially conditioning far-right extremists, enculturating their identity, somehow providing the circumstances for a more malevolent purpose, as well as their justifications for violence. And there is truth to this, right? Complex and networked digital environments are increasingly used to gain and contribute to an emerging transnational perspective. Extremists in these spaces are increasingly diversified in their use of platforms to mass circulate content. They're also concentrating and appropriating public spaces, gathering in large alternative platforms to avoid content moderation and deplatforming, as well as using these adjacent spaces to better mainstream their narratives. Okay, sure. So ecosystem feels intuitively true, and it certainly sounds important, but to someone inexperienced in the biological sciences, and when presented on its own, ecosystems is doing a lot of work. And it sounds somewhat superficial to help explain how and why far-right extremism emerges online. Indeed, and particularly among human ecologists and certain terrorism scholars, the term ecosystem does involve layers where ideas and beliefs can be overlaid and will influence human psychology and behavioral development. But if we primarily focus on these ideas and beliefs, ecosystem can serve as a simple placeholder for ideology. Okay, sure. Most far-right extremists today are, as we all are, profoundly interconnected with social networking technologies, and they are becoming increasingly intertwined, providing access to outcomes that were previously unattainable using a single platform or device. And this is something that we've already mentioned. So why is it that we focus so little until so recently on what digital ecosystems are, what they mean, what shared vocabulary can we use to discuss these ecosystems? What are the advantages and limitations of using ecological concepts? And why is it so important for understanding and preventing extremism today? Unsure how to answer these questions myself, I conducted a multidisciplinary literature review and made contact with approximately 12 ecologists and evolutionary biologists to try to understand what is meant by ecology, by the ecological approach, and by ecosystems. So just briefly, ecology is considered a method of scientific study. It's a classification system that encompasses both existing and emerging networks of biological as well as non-biological things as the nature of their interaction and development is uncovered. An ecological approach does encompass the interaction between intrinsic components that are vital to the individual. This could be the ways in which their brain manages organ systems or their molecular biology, and how that interacts with external forces. But it is more so concerned with 3 units of scale. And these are populations, which individuals that are belonging to the same group, communities, which are units composed of all the populations living in a given area. And then you have ecosystems. And these are communities as well as their physical environments all considered together. In this sense, ecosystem is one aspect or segment nested within a larger environment and itself is a container of hierarchical systems comprised of networked things. It connotes an assembly of scalable and interconnected ecosystems that will continue to expand until it encompasses and represents the globe as well as the wider universe. There are several high-level approaches to studying ecosystems. For instance, one approach considers the ecosystem to be the focus of the ecosystem, such as their function or their role within the environment. This would be akin to following the bear in front of you to see what it is that they do, what do they interact with, and what are the consequences on the bear's behavior and development over time. Another view sees the ecosystem as a generally focuses on the flow of matter or energy between organisms. This is actually where we get the phrase food chains. There was a move to describe nature as a machine, a giant mechanistic monolith where energies, or in the case of the ways in which a bear consumes berries, the ways in which calories will flow from one node in the network to another, or they would say in the ways in which calories drip along chains between creatures. The third considers ecosystems to be a series of distinct geographies. So this is where you look at the physical surroundings almost to the exclusion of other parts of the ecosystem, and you try to understand what are the selective pressures and how does this represent patented areas of topography, climate, and geology, among many other things. And this seems to be most closely related to the approach taken in recent far-right online extremism studies. And there is extensive value in pursuing this approach, using well-known as well as novel methods and taking reference from the adjacent approaches I mentioned earlier. However, it should be noted that this was heavily critiqued in the 1990s by ecologist Roger Blue, among others, who suggested ecosystems interpretation, at least within biology, when it's reduced to simply a discrete geographic unit. This is partially based on a misquotation of Tainsley's original works. So in 1935, he defined the term, and in doing so, he did not actually emphasize the organism's spatial environment, as is often quoted and actually used to help justify this geographic approach, but instead he emphasized their special environment. And this is said to place the interest of the organism before the environment. Common among these approaches are general functions or abilities that are inherent to ecology. For instance, ecology offers a classification system to name and label a complex hierarchy of systems, networks, settings, processes, as well as the organisms who dwell therein. As Tainsley suggested, the ability to classify relationships and the nature of their interrelation does effectively reduce complexity. It also establishes structure, relationship, and order. Ecology cultures a holistic perspective, a way to deeply describe the interconnection and interdependence of these ever-expanding networks, yet in finer detail, it does demand a mechanistic way of thinking about how each node in the network actually connects with one another and what are the developmental consequences of that. It fundamentally supports investigations into the systematic relationship between settings and those able to experience them, what uniquely characterizes their experiences, and what consequences does this have for this development. Based on their observations, ecologists have and continue to devise various management strategies to conserve or remove conditions that are considered to be unhealthy or unsustainable for both the organisms and the environments under study. As you're well aware, these functions or abilities are extremely valuable, and they have quickly gained attention across a wide range of natural and social science to which ecology now finds residence. As ecology gained popularity, its various theories and approaches were increasingly distilled into oversimplified analogies and metaphor. The tenets of ecology were adapted, of course, to suit an impressive array of disciplines and situations where these adaptations were thought of as being necessary in order to gain a greater conceptual understanding of what was understudied. Although the study of systemic relationship does offer an array of principles and properties that can be applied to almost any ecosystem, when these principles arrive in a new discipline, what is then considered an organism and what is considered an environment was suddenly open for classification. For example, where once ecology was used to explain how plant communities retained a state of equilibrium, and this is a part of the reason why ecology was able to establish itself as a distinct subfield of biology, it was soon used to understand how humans experienced the institutional organization of society. It was then used to see how media technology emerged and developed and interacted with one another in entertainment industries, how computer systems could be strategically designed to optimize for certain functions. Now, this same formula draws attention to the destructive nature of violent extremism as it emerges from today's digital environments. Understandably, it is the responsibility of the researcher to define for themselves and for their colleagues what their view of the ecosystem is. And as terrorism studies and extremism studies evolves, so will our understanding and the definition of online extremist ecosystems evolve along with it. However, because such ecosystems has yet to be theorized or conceptualized in any rigorous or consistent manner, it's important to know that we shouldn't allow this definition to become so restrictive or so diluted so as that we lose relevance to either science or management. The elasticity of ecosystems in this way, it does intellectual license. But in doing so, it can surrender an inclusive description or universally agreed typology as unachievable, where certain concepts that are core to its meaning are subsequently ignored, overemphasized, or misinterpreted. So the following is a curated collection of concepts and characteristics of ecosystems. The illustration breaks down ecosystem into useful component parts and processes that collectively enable it to operate, and individually, I would say, provide an opportunity for measurement and experimentation. These concepts are not a definitive list, but these are characteristics that were often cited in the literature over time, and when applied, may be particularly useful for us when considering the online extremist ecosystem. However, no one concept, characteristic, or process presented here exists in isolation, and an ecological framework would seek to order and understand how they interact and in what ways can we understand and apply them both in combination and individually. For example, in biology, self-organization refers to a foundational quality. It's a underlying enabling function that makes all other functions within a biological ecosystem possible. Biological ecosystems in this way are thought to share operational as well as design principles with digital ecosystems. This field of biomimicry is fascinating and provided some of the products that I'm sure some of us hold dear, even if we don't know it stems from itself. And in this way, self-organization, as well as problem solving, as well as the process of succession are all related here. And I'll return to the concept of succession later. For instance, in computer sciences, self-organization is also a foundational quality and enabling function. However, it is rigorously distinguished from biology, as well as the remaining media ecology. Self-organization itself highlights how multiple layers, as well as how agents, environments, information, and what drives them are all organized between these different layers. So rather than identifying individual drivers. Self-organization helps to understand what are the key processes that are systematizing and organizing these closely related drivers. In terrorism studies, self-organization actually features very rarely and with limited reference to the ways networked clusters of synthetic users are systematized. And this was in a paper that was peering into a newly labeled ecosystem called the online hate ecology. However, they really clarify whether its conceptual components are comparable to biology, nor recognize that social media companies do not disclose how these self-organization systems work. And this forces us to try to de-engineer the effects of social media, at least insofar as the ways in which its technology and users are self-organized. And what are these effects on far-right online extremist communities? Studies that seek to understand digital ecosystems in this way need to understand how such platforms self-organize and in what ways these systems may connect with other platforms and devices. In collaboration with Julian and Lise Waldeck and Brian Bolson-Stanton at Macquarie, with support with our great colleagues from the Resolve Network, we sought to better understand what certain ecological concepts mean in practice. What happens when you try to empirically substantiate them in a case study? For instance, we reasoned that because digital ecosystems revolve an interconnected set of systems, they are likely to be networked and dynamic, to say the least. And we therefore focused on, at a minimum, how change is measured in and between these environments, such as forms of content moderation, changes to platform features, or how changes to the ways in which users travel between different spaces. And this is a way of applying concepts like network or dynamism. And in doing so, researchers can have a way of theoretically and methodologically ascertaining how online extremist communities change and adapt to disruptions in their online environments. Networks in this way refer to a series of interconnected things that in sum make up an ecosystem. In media and communication studies, as well as computer sciences, networks are frequently associated and considered core to things like multi-actor networks, and they characterize this complex, non-linear nature of digital ecosystems. Of course, networks are essential to social media and are used to understand power relations and discourse and its character, the flows of ideology between members in online spaces. And by characterizing a network of patterned activity, you can better apply stable and unstable judgments to extremist communications on social networking sites, where information is circulated in an informal and often unbounded manner, where administrators wield less control over how information is shared, what does it mean, how does it evolve, and what's its social impact. This means that some networks will be easier to disrupt than others, but also that populations will likely find ways to evade many controls that are imposed upon them by platform administrators, as we know. However, while networks imply a kind of interdependence, the concept does not really reveal the nature or the developmental consequences of their interactions. In saying this, networks, of course, holds great theoretical potential as a component to, say, other studies looking at the succession of communities over time. Again, bear with me, I will return to succession in due time. Dynamism is the capacity to remain agile and resilient against these disturbances and is extensively used in descriptions of complex systems, both characteristic of digital and biological systems. Future studies could explore the ways in which these disruptions at multiple levels impact violent extremist use and long-term relationship with certain platforms and devices. In what ways do these platforms' designs increase or decrease the complexity of far-right extremist narratives and behavior? It could also comment on the result of certain adaptations in behavior or the ways in which these adaptations further incentivize greater diversity or the severity of narratives that are spread and expressed online. However, in order to achieve this, a move towards multi-layered changes as opposed to working with snapshots of online activity as needed. This is, for obvious reasons, very difficult. Social media disrupts an already complex causal chain of influence, and activity is challenging to observe, obtain, and analyze at multiple levels simultaneously. However, these concepts, they highlight the importance of taking into consideration both interconnectedness as well as innovation on both sides of the screen. Because I and others would argue social media software and hardware wields a bidirectional influence on violent extremists in the same way that a geological feature within a landscape interacts with certain animals within the land, and their interaction confers changes on both of them. For instance, social media facilitates an extremist's intention to action their beliefs, but it also and simultaneously shapes their intentions and affects their beliefs. In collaboration with Bharath Ganesh at Amsterdam University and Kenton Bell from the University of Wollongong, we drew on ecological thinking to examine the presence and influence of software and hardware upon incel masculinities, seeking to determine the prevalence and association between different digital technologies in their everyday life. We wanted to focus on mundane practices and meaning-making systems and the settings in which incel masculinities are articulated and constructed. We drew on scraped social media data from the forum website called incels.is. This was kindly provided to us by Cambridge Cybercrime Centre, and this is a subset of their Extreme BB dataset with posts dating from November 2017 to December 2021. And here we wanted to focus on the most popular threads. So we analyzed the top 10% of the website's forum. This was nearly 30,000. And this was measured by the number of posts within each thread. Our working sample was over 2.1 million posts. And this represented over 31% of all posts on the website upon data collection. We used two base text analysis. These were frequency distribution and word collocation. Word frequencies were initially established with a set of 30 keywords. Each word collocation was then based on those keywords which received more than 1,000 mentions. These were Tinder, Reddit, phone, Discord, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, incels.co, Screen, and 4chan. Results from the entire corpus also underwent a cursory thematic analysis to identify what terms are relevant to technology and social identities in the first 150 most popular phrases. In using the term socio-technical ecosystem, we assumed several things. One, technologies that we were looking at were not developed, nor are they used in isolation, but rather we consider them to be embedded in wider societal frameworks that are both intertwined and mutually reinforcing. We use this framing largely as a classification system to begin identifying their prevalence and association in online incel communities, specifically looking at their consequences on masculinities. In this sense, and in keeping with ecological thinking, we saw incels and the technologies they use as not entirely separate, but instead integral component parts of larger systems that are evolving in real time in response to one another. However, we're also sympathetic to the idea that this is not a mutual coexistence, right? These technologies were not designed with an incel's well-being in mind, and thus the systematic relationship is likely to be in some way a contributing factor. I should mention that this study is still in press. However, I'm happy to provide a few preliminary findings here. The findings here stress the centrality of software and hardware in incel ideology in everyday life. Among the three main categories that we looked at, these were online dating sites, social networking platforms, and hardware. Findings indicate the preoccupation with Tinder, Reddit, and phone. So Tinder was mentioned over 10,500 times. It actually represented nearly 97% of all mentions when compared to other online dating sites. Reddit featured over 8.7 thousand times and composed more than 35% of all mentions, again, compared to other social networking sites. Interestingly, though, there were certain terms that signaled platform-specific features, and these were things like browser, channel, subreddit, thread, post, forum, as well as more abstract social software features like user, avatar, username, and also algorithm. Phone featured over 5,000 times, represented more than half of all mentions of other hardware, but there were other hardwares mentioned, particularly screen, computer, TV, camera, machine, as well as server. Such technologies offer incels the opportunity to connect with others, as well as themselves in otherwise unlikely or unattainable ways outside of this context. This software and hardware both then contextualizes as well as makes it possible for individuals to negotiate masculine traits to gain popularity as well as recognition. When referencing the dating site Tinder, for instance, incel discussions revolved the platform's capacity to amplify as well as exacerbate certain stereotypes. They would argue it distorts the sexual marketplace, resulting in an unfair distribution of potential partners, as well as perpetuating a hegemonic ideal. Supporting these claims are concepts championed by incels themselves, such as hypergamy, where women select chads who are more attractive than marginalized and subordinated males. This disparity endures, incels will suggest, because chads themselves can pursue sexual relationships with multiple women simultaneously, despite displaying an unattractive personality type. For instance, one user made the following assertion: even Chad, who is a loner and a loser, can still get laid. References to race appeared frequently, but less so than sexuality, and this generally makes sense, at least intuitively. Incel discussions generally focused on attractiveness rather than race or expressions of ethnicity. As one user said, race is a subset of looks. Looks is supreme, not race. Because online dating sites are said to reward hegemonic males or chads, incels then discuss strategies on how to surreptitiously pantomime hegemonic masculinity in order to gain access to women, a technique that they referred to as chadfishing. As one user said, heck, I could even make a quick Tinder chatfish to confirm my thoughts on hypergamy. This digital model, it entrenches the incel inclination to view and appraise themselves from the outside looking in. And this aspect is well represented in the disconcerting frequency with which references to technology are made alongside and intertwined with incel ideology. Everyone may arrive online under dissimilar circumstances. However, their interactions while using the same technologies may afford a relatively stable environment for them to entangle their masculinity. Mundane practices, both real as well as imagined, enable this systematic relationship. For example, we saw users discussing imaginary scenarios, creating a simulation in discussion where chads are thought to behave in certain ways in relationship to particular software features, right? What would a chad do in this situation? How would a chad react? What can we learn from creating a situation in our minds where Chad is using the same technologies we are to express these ideas? So this merges personal history, such as years of longing for sexual, romantic, or social connection, with present deficits. And this, in a way, is what Kramer referred to as the post-digital era, this loss of hope that the internet is purely an emancipatory force in the world. And incels will rationalize this loss of hope, or this realization that the technologies they use are not going to bring them the success that they so wanted, as a consequence of tyrannical feminism upon the tech sector. As one user almost confronted another with, you think that you'd get laid if it wasn't for advancements in technology? These findings emphasize three perspectives and point to a currently ongoing study. First, the importance of examining actual men and boys and their developmental experiences in relationship to boyhood and masculinity, as well as their biological development. Second, we need to move beyond denouncatory terms to examine the incel's arrested development, as Grace Sharkey once recommended. And this includes trying to understand the disadvantages faced by men and boys in the post-digital era in which they are enculturated in. Third, the importance of socio-technical and ecological perspectives within scholarly research, for sure, but as well as providing an opportunity for practitioners who are striving to intervene in these systematic relationships. This may include consultants from men and masculinity studies, psychologists who specialize in addiction studies, or counter-violent extremism practitioners. This case study has provided the theoretical and methodological template for my current study, which seeks to apply a combination of concepts, namely networks, complexity, and dynamism, within a greater ecological process called succession, for which these concepts are considered to be core. Looking at larger retrospective social media data sets that are representative of many different manospheric online communities, and this is actually the Cybercrime Center Extreme BB dataset. Instead of looking at incels.is, we're looking to expand to look at the entire dataset in order to measure changes to the ecological composition and structure of these communities and their physical surroundings. Here, we're trying to look at stages in development that can be defined along fluctuations in complexity, such as the diversity and severity of narratives expressed, and then compare and contrast our findings to studies of succession in nature. So what are some of the practical implications of this, right? Well, what is the pragmatic value here? While I'm not a practitioner myself, I'm very, very fortunate to be involved in conversations with counter-violent extremism experts who try to provide insight into this opportunity and context. I'm led to believe that because CVE programs largely deal with ideologically driven violence, it's understandable why ideology often takes the center of any attempt to bring about change. For example, when faced with a client who actively participates in far-right extremist forums, this tends to be viewed through the lens of ideology, not necessarily behavior. And as I'm told, it can leave certain practitioners perplexed as to whether the potential client is even suitable for the program, or how should we design and tailor this program for their needs. And there are a few suitable qualified practitioners with the personal history of both being in a far-right online extremist community and someone who is willing to tackle nuanced ideological discussions, and who is also willing to support this person in their reintegration into society. As resources are often limited, this focus and framing around ideology alone may not necessarily be the most accurate or effective for developing these interventions, particularly within this post-digital era. Ecological thinking, on the other hand, could concentrate on the modes of contact between the person and their environments. Taking the central premise of ecology into account offers valuable points of departure in discussions about how do we counter far-right extremism and violence as it emerges in digital environments. For example, rather than broadly categorizing these environments in loose reference to the person, they may be online and offline, and then tailoring the interventions according to these definitions of the domains in which people are spending time. An ecologist may wish to examine how exactly does the person interact with specific features in their immediate environment. What modes of interaction facilitate this relationship, and what are their experiences of them? While patterns of online ideologies are well documented, What modes of interaction are used, and in what ways can these modes be interrupted at an individual level seem to be less well explored. Of course, this is not to say ideology is not important, of course. It is a critical intellectual component of violent extremism. But perhaps we need to spend more time considering how far-right ideologies are embedded in these networks of platforms as devices, communities and their physical surroundings, social networking systems, as well as the companies who designed them. In fact, I see this as a valuable opportunity for practitioners to learn from and invite strategies from other behavioral change fields, such as interventions that account for social media addiction. So while ideology, of course, plays a vital role, incorporating alternative practices into a practitioner's strategy may provide a very practical first step. For example, approaching a client to talk about their use of social media in relation to extremism is arguably a much easier conversation to have rather than starting from the outset with the aim to change their belief system. Focusing on behavior change also offers an opportunity for practitioners to involve additional avenues of support as well as expertise from their colleagues in adjacent areas. Programs that would teach skills and techniques in order to recognize and then improve a person's preoccupation with technology is relatively successful in other places. Incorporating this professional insight will not only advance practitioner knowledge, but likely increase the pool of potential practitioners that are able to contribute. Tackling behavior change may also address some of the criticisms that seem to be surrounding CVEs, such as a lack of effective benchmarks and measurable criteria in order to gauge success. Interventions that first address a client's relationship to the medium they use is one important one. It enables practitioners to employ measurable practices as a part of a broader collection of social and technological practices, including degrees of disengagement from their smartphone, limiting their daily use of certain platforms, as well as highlighting the role and the intended influence of these technologies in their everyday life. And I think this makes sense. If a client regularly uses technology to interact with concerning content, ameliorating their relationship, at least with the mediums that they use to connect with this content, may render opportunities to experience disillusionment or develop a pluralist attitude more likely. If a client regularly uses social media to interact with extremist groups or their leaders, particularly groups who are capable of producing feelings of exclusion, betrayal, isolation, and threat, these technologies will continue to support identity construction that is conducive to an extreme sense of self and an understanding of their surroundings that may even recommend users to other users who have similar identity templates. Aside from the pressure of being connected to extremist communities, extensive social media use is, as we are increasingly aware, adds stress to the client's mental health, their cognition, their collective sense-making, not to mention remove opportunities and strain efforts to reintegrate them into society. As we learn from our efforts to mitigate the negative impacts of these technologies in society generally, perhaps ecological thinking can help translate these hard-earned lessons and more effectively integrate them into counter-violent extremism programs today. Of course, this conversation today would not be possible without various colleagues who I'm tremendously fortunate to collaborate with and who have greatly contributed to the results as well as the ideas presented here. All right, Julian, I look forward to your questions.
Well, Jade, thank you very much for extremely interesting and exciting presentation. Very detailed, both in terms of the concepts and theory, also great illustrations. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. I think the first question I'd ask is, around some of the practical limitations and difficulties of doing ecosystem style research, of doing cross-platform studies. What types of difficulties did you come up against during your doctoral research? And how have you been able to get around these?
It's a great question and something I had to face up to rather early in the PhD program. It's interesting, talking to ecologists and trying to understand their approach to the ecosystems that they're studying. They too struggle with similar challenges, and one of them I mentioned during the presentation, that is trying to measure and make sense of activity that occurs across multiple layers within the ecosystem, particularly for us in this space. Having access to that data can be difficult, while obtaining snapshots of online activity is relatively easy, although I understand that was not the case some years ago. There was a sort of a dearth of social media activity, and now it seems we're almost inundated with it. Perhaps moving from this position of strength methodologically, we can start to look to other layers and forms of information that may give us a greater understanding and ability to contextualize that social media data. That may be one strategy in order to gain a greater understanding of what is happening across multiple levels of this online extremist ecosystem, and in what ways ecological thinking can help us render this into more practical suggestions. And this relates to the second challenge, was in what ways is this actually useful? And I find in conversations with ecologists who are listening intently to the ways in which terrorism scholars are now using some of the concepts that they hold dear, they're wondering and will even ask me outright, but how do you translate something like self-organization into a series of strategies to prevent someone from engaging in mass violence or entertaining particularly extreme beliefs, considering the stochastic nature of these phenomena today? And these challenges, I think, will continue throughout the study. As I mentioned before, our relationship to ecology is so new, and I think it's important to try to make contact with those who think about ecology full time, because they have also wrestled with these challenges, not just within the biological sciences, but also our friends and colleagues from media and communications and the computer sciences. That is becoming an increasingly important player in how we come to approach far-right online extremism. So a greater sense of collaboration between players in academia, but also the ways in which ecology will be understood in 5 years from now should be, and I hope will be, very different to what it is today. And some of those challenges should be overcome.
One of the criticisms I sometimes hear about doing cross-platform ecosystem-style research in relationship to violent extremism and the internet is the naturalistic fallacy, whereas ecosystems out there in the world are not necessarily created by human agency. The online networks within which extremism manifests absolutely are created by human agency, and they're patterned by things like capitalism and market forces and so on. Does this really diminish or even discredit the idea that ecosystem science brings anything useful to the space of human sociology online?
I am biased here. I mean, I think that ecology's value will hold true despite accusations of the naturalistic fallacy. I don't necessarily think that if something is considered to be true in nature, it needs to be true within more social or human spaces. I think it's important to manage expectations when using ecology, right? It's important to strive for rigor and consistency when adopting these concepts, but there's a way in which you can maintain its value without necessarily giving yourself over to fallacies such as the one that you mentioned. For instance, I personally am not aware of the degree of agency that is inherent in and wields animals out in the wild, and that might be a conversation for another time. But the degree of agency that certain social media companies have over how their platforms are designed and the ways in which they operate are well known. And that may be another space for which terrorism scholars move into with greater frequency in order to better understand and contextualize the online activity that we have readily access to today.
All right, now I'm going to put you on the spot now, Jade, with this question. If you had to respond to a practitioner, let's say somebody working within the tech sector, within the tech companies, who's trying to identify and prevent violent extremism on their platform, and you are asked to give three clear advantages that ecosystem style research or thinking gives to them as a practitioner, in a sentence or less for each, not less, a sentence or two for each, what would you say are the three main benefits of ecosystem thinking that can help them do their job?
Great question. I'll pause for a moment to ponder. Ecosystem thinking concentrates on the systematic relationship between the user and the technologies your company has released into the wild or into society. Three recommendations could be: in understanding how your technology interacts with users, both the intended use and the actual use for which users come to appreciate of your products. In what ways can you shape that relationship to be increasingly healthy and sustainable in the same way that ecologists attempt to ameliorate the conditions by which their chosen animal interacts with features in their landscape? Another one could be understanding that the product that you've provided your enormous population of users, for which these companies like to boast about, is situated within much larger processes. And it's important to recognize that your contribution to those processes should not go unrecognized. And perhaps it would be useful to take those processes into account when making future design choices, particularly consulting not only with the users themselves, but also with other practitioners who feel the problems of your designs and helping to manage their clients' lives. And lastly, I was really struck by the philosophical underpinnings of ecology. I think that there's a lot to learn from how ecologists view their ecosystems. In almost every conversation I've had with an ecologist, my heart swells with how fond they feel for their ecosystems, how much they wish well the animals that they care and study. And I do wish that we had a more compassionate and collaborative approach, both to social media companies and some of the people for which we are concerned about. So the last recommendation would be to take some of the philosophical underpinnings of ecology and see whether or not it can be translated not into economic ends, but to more pro-social and pro-constructive ends.
Thank you very much. Great response. And I'm going to ask you one final question, Jade. How do you see the future of research into ecosystems or using ecosystem frameworks to think about cross-platform interaction? What would you like to see in this field of research going forward? You're very much, I think, a trailbreaker in this space. How would you like to see it develop? And what are you hopeful about in it?
Well, a lot has changed since Tainsley's day. Ecology is very prominent, and is often partnered with other fields of study, such as molecular biology and evolutionary biology, and increasingly aspects of the social sciences and humanities, such as international relations. There's actually a research institute now at Oxford University that attempts to partner international studies with biology and to better understand their respective importance and influence on one another. So I see that to be quite a promising trend. People are becoming increasingly encouraged by others in their attempt to draw the distance and the importance between the natural and the social sciences. I was recently connected with someone over LinkedIn who has a strong background in molecular biology and ecology, and who is now working in the myths and disinformation space to try to understand and prevent the ways that both academics and other government bodies can perpetuate these problems. So for me, I would really love to see people continue to take the courage to try to bring together people from desperate places within academia to see what it is that they know and can contribute to some of the problems and places that we are currently struggling to make progress on. I think that ecology has an enormous amount of theoretical and methodological potential for terrorism studies if taken seriously and if confronted proper. But in doing that, we would need to invite people from those spaces into our world, welcome them, and offer them opportunities to see whether a collaboration could be made, what realities need to be taken into consideration, and in what ways could this provide a new branch of terrorism studies into the foreseeable future. And those products of that collaboration, I cannot predict, but I'm certainly looking forward to seeing them.
Well, I think that's a very good place for us to wrap up. Look, thank you again very much, Jade, for the insights into your research. Good luck with the research, and with future projects. On behalf of the VOX-Pol network, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here to present today.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Julian.